Good afternoon. My name is Bonnie Vandermeulen, Training Coordinator for Wisconsin Facets. On behalf of the entire Wisconsin Facets staff, I'd like to thank you for joining us. Our webinar today is Dyslexia, What Parents Should Know. Most students who struggle with reading and spelling have characteristics of dyslexia. For parents of these children, the importance of understanding the nature and implications of dyslexia is crucial in helping their child develop fundamental reading skills. Our presenter today is Cheryl Ward. Before working on behalf of students who struggle learning to read, Cheryl was a healthcare administrator for many years. Her interest in education and knowledge about dyslexia resulted from her youngest being diagnosed with dyslexia. After leaving healthcare, Cheryl trained as a Scottish Rite Children Dyslexia Center. Cheryl continues working at the CDC and also works as a multidiscipline private practice at North Shore Center in Mequon. Cheryl is the past president of the Wisconsin branch of the International Dyslexia Association and is among the founding members of the Wisconsin Reading Coalition and Literate Nation, working to inform educators, legislators, and the public about evidence-based reading practices for students and reading preparation for teachers to ensure all students will be lifelong literate participants in the intellectual process of gaining meaning from print. It is my pleasure today to introduce to you Cheryl Ward. Cheryl?
Hi, thank you so much, Bonnie, for that nice introduction, and thank you for allowing me the opportunity once again to have this discussion with our listeners. Dyslexia is something that is so prevalent that we want to be able to make sure that to be able to ameliorate and to really help your kids, that we share basic information, continue to share basic information with our parent group here and any of the educators on the line. And for those of you that may have heard me speak in the past, I welcome you and feel free to please type questions in. Bonnie can field those questions and can interrupt me with questions or wait till the end. We'll have a question and answer time at the end as well. So certainly we all agree that no other skill taught in school and learned by school children is more important than reading. It is a gateway to all of our academic knowledge. And if kids can't learn to read efficiently, that path will begin to be a major obstacle in all the academic areas that they encounter over school and certainly carry on into their adult life. So here in the United States, we have about 50 million school children, and we have an enormous number of kids that are struggling to read with and without dyslexia, well over 10 million kids. And we know that we have a graduation from high school reading proficiency issue, because we know we don't even have 50% of our kids reading proficiently on measure. And certainly we have many more children that struggle year after year and fall further behind. So this leads our kids to that do graduate. We're really graduating kids yearly that are equivalent to major cities in the United States. So we're talking about a lot of kids that aren't reading well in a society that demands that they do. So what's happening here in Wisconsin? We certainly have a large problem. Many of you know that. There are lots of initiatives going on across our state that recognize this, but I want to remind everyone when we're talking about our students with disabilities, this is a very large group of kids, and 89% of these kids are reading well below proficiency, and we know that the vast majority of them are those that have been identified with dyslexia. So we know that there are a lot of variables that predict literacy outcomes. We certainly know that your socioeconomic status, we know that oral language skills, phonological skills, knowing your alphabet, letter sound knowledge, sound to symbol, and certainly all of these comorbid factors, working memory and executive functioning, are very I heard that, are very important considerations that predict literacy outcomes. But I want to particularly draw your attention to oral language skills and phonological awareness. These are the bedrock foundation as we build our house and we build the skills for reading knowledge. It starts with the oral language. Can your children hear the sounds of language? Can they then manipulate those sounds? So this is the first predictor. So why is it so hard to teach reading? Because it really is. It's very complex. And it is, again, as I've said in the past, that we do not go to school to learn our native tongue. We have very sophisticated centers within our brain, but reading is not evolved. Reading is very infant-like in comparison to speaking. Speaking is now an innate network within our brain wiring. It is neurologically tethered to allow us in our natural development to learn to speak and to communicate orally. We don't go to speaking school. But reading isn't that way. We have a disparate group of neurons within our brain structure that's relatively new. We don't have a reading center in the brain. So as Louisa Moat says, reading is rocket science. This is something that needs to be modeled and taught along a continuum. So you should be seeing on your screens, you should be seeing the strands of early literacy development. This is known as the Hollis-Scarborough rope. And this might be one of the most important slides that you will see in terms of thinking about dyslexia and in terms of thinking about reading for everyone, no matter what their abilities are, what kind of, if they're typical or if they have any kind of, quote, diagnosis. Because all of these sub-skills, these discrete and unique sub-skills must come together and be woven very tightly over time. And typically, if we think of it in terms of a school child's, the curriculum path of in school, we're looking at preschool to third grade, that we really want to get these skills tight and we really want to work on them individually. So, but we have two main categories, and this is kind of that simple view of reading, that if you can recognize the word, and you can do that well, and if you can understand the words together, that you will then yield to strong, skilled, good reading. Because after all, we know the goal of reading is comprehending for meaning. That's the goal, regardless. But you'll notice on the slide, we have language comprehension at the top, word recognition on the bottom. And the word recognition is really that basement component. Can the individual hear the sounds of our language, the syllables, the smallest unit of sound, which we'll talk about a little bit? Can they then use those sounds that they hear and relate them back to an alphabet representation, which leads to the decoding the word? In other words, our alphabet is really mimicking our oral language. And lastly, can they do it very quickly? Can they read it quickly where they can read and be able to get into the upper strand of language comprehension with sufficient background knowledge about a subject, with sufficient vocabulary, with sufficient understanding of how sentences are put together and what words can have multiple meanings, as an example? Are they able to make inferences, and will they understand the different kinds of knowledge texts that they're reading? So you'll notice on these two ropes that are coming together, or these two bits of rope coming together to make this strong rope, you'll notice that word recognition is braided as opposed to language comprehension, which is wrapping. Those skills are being wrapped. And that's very important difference, because word recognition requires all of those things: hearing the language, matching it with an alphabetic symbol, and doing it quickly. One of those strands is going to have a cascading effect on how well one recognizes words. Whereas language comprehension is a little bit different. Some of our kids may have good vocabulary, but they may not be able to put it into a sentence structure that makes sense, or that is as sophisticated as maybe the vocabulary word that they know. They may have limited background knowledge, and certainly that can happen in a lot of our environments. Certainly you think of children that don't have a lot of opportunity for different experiences. So those comprehension skills are a little different in that you can have some of them, all of them, and they can be developed and not have all of your comprehension fall apart, which is very different than word recognition, where you really need those basement skills intact. So why is it so hard to teach all of this? Reading programs are not going to be effective if your child has needs that are not being addressed within the program. So if the program is not appropriate in addressing those needs, if it goes too fast or too slow, your child is going to be at risk for not acquiring the skills or the practice time they need, or the information that they need to gain the appropriate knowledge. There may be and this is often influenced, unfortunately, and it's certainly understandable. Our children can't all be taught one-on-one, nor should we have that expectation. But often we have groups of kids that are mismatched within some of these smaller reading groups. And again, you can go too slow, too fast, you can skip over skills that some children frankly may need. So again, you have to be very mindful of the instruction. Go as fast as you can, but as slow as you must to meet the needs of that child if they are going to achieve reading mastery.
Cheryl, this is Bonnie. Sorry to interrupt. We do have a question on the rope strands, and the question was, which of the strands would you consider to be the most crucial?
Well, if you, again, the whole strand of word recognition, that bottom component, the phonological awareness, decoding, and sight. And as I will state later, we'll talk about the phonological awareness, and that oral language and that ability is the most distinct predictor of a struggling reader. So those basement skills of word recognition are the starting point. And then just to, add on that often, because comprehension is our goal, and it is our goal, there's no question about it, but I think often the pressures are just so large for our teachers. They want their students to do well. They want their students to be able to comprehend meaning, and so do their administrators, and so do the public. And so I think sometimes we're very unfair to our teachers because we don't give them the opportunity to firm up some of these word recognition skills. And I'll get into that later. So certainly when it comes to talking about this word recognition, those are the skills that you have to work on very hard. That does not mean you don't work on vocabulary and comprehension strategies, absolutely not. But you're never going to be able to get to reading sufficiently if you do not recognize the importance of doing the lower foundational word recognition skills, actually being able to lift the print off the page. That's critical. So if we were to look at a bell curve, we will 100% of everyone, no matter where you live, no matter what your ethnicity is, no matter what country, etc., no matter your economic status, none of that matters. All people are going to be on a bell curve, and we're going to have a bunch of people in the middle, and that's our average person, and then we're going to have some people that have high skills and some with lower skills. Now, if we think of it in terms of reading, okay, we're going to think of our typical core curriculum, our school experience is often, certainly historically, and certainly it doesn't stay there now. We know we want to serve the whole continuum, but think of the majority of people, the average person, in that middle category from about 20 to 80%. So you've got 60% of your kids are going to fall into somewhere on this average range. some people, 20% or less, 15% or less, but it's a very real number, are going to actually have a opportunity for diagnosis with dyslexia. Well, what does that mean? Notice I use the word opportunity. What I'm really intending here is that you're going to have a large percentage, a notable percentage of people, all people, that are going to struggle learning to read, and that you're going to be able to see this in, within brain scans, for example. But we don't do brain scans on everyone, nor should we, but so they're going to be exhibiting characteristics of dyslexia. And then you're going to have many within the average range that need additional instruction. So in some ways, we're talking about the very same thing, whether you have dyslexia or a struggling reader. There are many components of instruction that are identical, that are the same. It's how intense you get.
Cheryl, the question here now is, how can you confirm a student is dyslexic?
And I will address this a little bit later to some extent, but I will say that to be able to confirm a student has dyslexia is, I don't believe it's controversial, but it is controversial because there are many individuals that insist that it can only be a medical diagnosis. And indeed, there is lots of truth to that, that someone trained in how to administer formal testing and at these various sub-skills that I talked about earlier in regards to the strand, there can be a profile where a child can take those subsets, be measured by a school psychologist or a neuropsychologist outside of school, for example. And they are that's where we're the most comfortable seeing that diagnosis. However, there are certainly many other individuals that are trained to administer these tests. And so if you think about it in a way of taking the word out of it, so to speak, you can think of it in terms, again, I'll use the word characteristics of dyslexia. So whether you have an, quote, official diagnosis or not, you can still identify many children that have weaknesses in these various skill sets. Whether you call it dyslexia or not may or may not have any implications within your school environment. And again, I find that that's somewhat inconsistent depending on the schools and maybe the individuals that you're talking with. So I'll try to get into that a little bit more later. So this is kind of germane, our next slide here, dyslexia at a glance. Dyslexia really is one word that just really is putting together two Greek words. It's a difficulty with words, and so it's fairly simplistic. We call dyslexia the name of a very kind of specific learning disability in reading, and once you can use a word, it sometimes makes interventions easier, potentially, if you can identify and if there's some interventions that are associated with it. But dyslexia is characterized by some kind of an unexpected difficulty learning to read, particularly when you're looking at a peer group. If you're in first grade and most people are expected to have a reading skill set that looks like A and your student doesn't, that's an unexpected difficulty. That's assuming that that there is not concern about other extenuating circumstances like low IQ potentially, or other factors that, including motivation, that might be affecting the child. It's also very important to know, and I've alluded to this, it's a language-based problem. Language-based meaning our communication-based problem, hearing the sounds of language, because you then need to be able to link it with an alphabetic representation. It may occur more often in boys. This is almost, not much of a point anymore. But it is certainly one of the hallmarks about the definition for dyslexia, and I think one that is very important is this is a subgroup of kids that have at least average IQ abilities. So these are bright kids. These are capable kids, but they have a wiring system in their brain, that's the neurological, in their brain that is not allowing them to easily learn the skills of reading in the way that is traditionally taught. And there is a very big genetic hereditary component. It affects somewhere 1 in 5, 1 in 6. You know, this is a really difficult number to get a handle on, but make no mistake, this is a number that is pervasive and it is all around us. So if you think of it in terms of having, you know, 10 people around you, 1 or 2 absolutely are going to be on this continuum. We know that they're taught both, these kids are taught both in general ed rooms and SPED classrooms. Whether they're identified or not identified, they're still going to be straddling instruction in both of these rooms. We know that students identified with dyslexia who are in the SPED classroom, as I alluded to, also are, you know, are a huge number. So the majority of kids receiving special education services are on a reading disability continuum, and it could be, you know, from 60 to, you know, 80%. Again, it's at all economic levels. And it also, dyslexia also can have quite a bit of comorbidity. There is a lot of comorbidity. I know ADHD is something that, you know, everyone is aware of, but there is, you know, there is a healthy percentage of kids that may have coexisting ADHD. So this executive functioning component can travel along and kind of muddy the water, and that's why some kids may get some additional services without having a dyslexia diagnosis, but might be identified with another health impairment such as ADHD, where they may be able to, you know, get services. But with
Cheryl, our next question is, can dyslexia develop later in school years, or would it present early on?
It would present early on, but you have to know how to look for it, you know how to read it, and the idea is where it looks like, and whoever the, you know, questioner, the person that asks this question is spot on in terms of, typically we don't even start talking about dyslexia until 2nd, 3rd grade or beyond. Well, why is that? It's because you're reaching a point of critical mass in terms of reading instruction, and that basic reading instruction. There's been several years of it, and the child is now falling further and further behind, despite the fact that they might be doing well in many other subject areas potentially. But the idea is that the older you get, the more ground there is to cover. And if you have a difficulty, it's going to become more and more complex. So that's why universal screening, done well, interpreted well, and then aggressively you know, intervenes, is really important. But of course, you know, that all has to be done with knowledge and fidelity. And certainly, the last bullet you can see here, we're thinking of dyslexia. It will and can cause problem with reading comprehension, because if you're not able to, and you might even orally understand what's being said, but if you can't read the vocabulary words, you're going to, again, read less, fall further behind. That's in essence, and that's how kids usually get identified. They are a little bit older. So here's the definition of dyslexia, and I'm just going to kind of go over this rather quickly. It is an SLD, a specific learning disability. It is part of who we are genetically, neurologically, in our brain. It has to do with accurate and quick word identification, which in terms of spelling and reading or decoding, they're hand in hand, right? You have to understand both. We sometimes separate spelling out. No, they go together. They are phonological components. That's the sound of language. And again, it's unexpected performance to their abilities that you would hope to see. And the secondary consequences, which I've stated, can be that comprehension can be lost, vocabulary can be lost or diminished, and background knowledge then can be lost or diminished because you're simply not able to gain the you're not able to keep the reading going on a trajectory that is gaining commensurate to their peers. So it really can have tremendous impact. So there are some myths about dyslexia. They are still sadly so pervasive, and it seems when I talk about myths, you know, to me it's like, oh, we're still talking about myths, but yes, we must still talk about myths. There is a myth that it's rare. As I stated, it is not rare. It is not a visual problem, but that's not to say that, you know, a student may have a vision problem or a musculature problem, but dyslexia isn't the result of any vision problem, and the research is clear. It is not developmental lagging. Kids won't outgrow it, and I hope that is, you know, something that is getting a much greater understanding in all of our schools. It's also a myth to think, oh, poor you, you have dyslexia, you're not going to be able to learn to read. That is completely false. It has nothing to do with low intelligence or motivation. And again, to the question earlier, it often, sadly, isn't. It is mistakenly understood that you really can't identify it until third grade. That is not true. You can really, they're seeing it in infants if you can scan an infant, which we don't, you know, but you can certainly spot this in kindergarten and even before. It is not simply as simple as seeing symbols backwards, and it doesn't mean that they are overall slow learners. In fact, we know it's universal. It involves the language system. It is a chronic and persistent condition, so it's just not going to be changed. That's the way you're wired. Just like someone's, you know, might have a natural sports ability or whatever. We know it's very effortful, and for people to learn to read, we know that the cognitive abilities are typical. We know that typical core instruction isn't going to be enough. It is something where those with dyslexia, if they get if they get interventions young enough, they can become very successful. And it certainly is not a disease. And the thing that is sometimes often very misunderstood is dyslexia is very unique to the individual. So it really requires a lot of skill sets to really identify the various needs of an individual. And that makes it a little bit more challenging, and that puts a lot of pressure on a lot of people. So we know that, again, that we have this large group of students with learning disabilities in our classrooms. And again, if we would only feel comfortable thinking that they're on a dyslexia continuum and that they have characteristics. And we know that the majority of these students are not properly diagnosed and certainly not given instruction, and that these children, these kids, become adults. So we have a huge opportunity within our adult population, and again, it's not too late to help them either. So if we're looking at all of these building blocks, we look at comprehension, vocabulary, fluency, phonics, phonemic awareness, and oral language. That bedrock skill, that bedrock beginning piece is oral language, and then phonemic awareness, the ability to manipulate sounds within language. I'm going to go back a second here and just maybe talk about that. Well,
and actually, as you're moving, I have a couple of questions here for you. A comment that was made, not many teachers have advanced certifications, nor can they identify children early. What can families do to ensure all teachers and speech pathologists can take the foundations of reading tests to learn reading sub-skills, not only newly licensed teachers, thereby helping all struggling readers and dyslexics?
Well, you know what? I'm going to hold that question because I do address that in just a little bit. If that person is okay, I will hold it because that is absolutely the foundation piece of this whole darn thing as far as, you know, making strides. So there is a lot to be said about that.
And then also just to follow that up, it was a statement to have early childhood providers understand what to look for in helping to prevent things too. How can families help with this process? So just keep those in mind for as you move along, okay?
Got it. Okay, so I backed up, you guys, back to the steps because I recognize that I wanted to give you an example that's maybe a little more meaningful. If you think of oral language as a communication as we're doing now, you're hearing my voice and you're hopefully understanding what I'm saying to you, but being able to have that in text form requires that you look at you're matching everything up, that you have a full grasp of phonics, right? I'm jumping past phonemic awareness. But if you have trouble hearing the differences within the words that I'm saying and having the difficulty matching what I say to a letter representation that's now embedded in the filing cabinet in your brain. So for example, if I say the word, this is very simplistic, but if I say the word cat and mitt, your brain is very quickly knowing that the C is saying a K sound and the A and is an A sound, and I change cat to mitt by putting in a short I sound, and you have to do this very quickly and you're manipulating all of this. But if I say chat, suddenly you know that the first sound is a ch, but there's two letters, CH, and all of that is that phonemic awareness business of hearing the individual sounds within words to be able to get to the phonics component. And if you can't manipulate those sounds, if you can't hear those individual sounds, this is where the biggest point of breakdown for our kids is in this phonemic awareness piece. And so when you think of early childhood providers, holy cow, again, right on target. Our early childhood, this is where we have tons of opportunity to be able to support our early childhood practitioners and being able to help our kids. Sadly, we often don't do that, although that is changing a lot. I know across the state we're doing some really good things, but I think we often think of early childhood as often separate from our K-12 environment. So what are some signs and symptoms? So you're think of these young kids again, or think of your older kids. Think of anybody you're concerned about. You know, was there a history of delayed or late speaking? Some children speak very early, some speak later. Some gain fast vocabularies, others not so much. This can be a symptom of, there's some oral language deficits potentially going on here. Does your young child, or again, your older child, I mean, I see kids right now, I'm working with a 6-year-old, cannot rhyme, cannot do it, can't recognize them, can't hear those individual sounds, certainly, you know, is not blending sounds together, is having trouble remembering printed words, where other kids, you know, those basic simple words that kids tend to know, like a, you know, frog or yellow or red colors, those kinds of things. Some kids struggle mightily with this. Some kids have difficulty with oral expression, finding the right words when speaking, kind of that tip of your tongue kind of thing. For some reason, there's some difficulty with some kids with right and left orientation, telling time. Not all, again, you don't have to tick off every box. But certainly there's a huge component of written work looking pretty weak as comparison to peers. But you can see the big tip-off here is that oral language deficit. So here we are by age group looking at some warning signs. So young kids, again, do they recognize the letters of the alphabet? Can they match the letters to the sounds? And are they beginning that blending work? Are they able to do it? Are they saying repetitively, are they kind of slaughtering some of their oral language? Now, some of this, you know, you have to really kind of look at this. Young children's a pretty big category here. But if you still have a, you know, 6, 7-year-old going lawn lower instead of lawnmower, that could say something to you. Can they and hear, and are they using new vocabulary words, or is it very difficult? Their vocabulary is very limited despite exposure. So, you know, again, and I talked about the rhyming and some of this rote learning that we hope day of the week, etc.
Cheryl, before you go on, we do have another question. I don't know if you want to wait for later for this one as well, because it talks about alternate suggestions for interventions. But the question was, you talk a lot about students with dyslexia receiving SPE, special ed services. As an educator and as a parent of a child who was just recently diagnosed, I have major concerns about placing my student in the SPE system. Do you have alternate suggestions for interventions?
Wow, that's a really excellent question and a hard one to answer, and one that's really hard to answer quickly. It's almost a whole nother discussion, because there is, I certainly understand, and I caught that this person was an educator and a parent, and so, you know, that's an opportunity for me to salute our educator, and knowing that sadly many of our special educators, and sadly the majority of our educators, they simply aren't prepared to provide appropriate interventions to this population. And so I do think that it can be a really tough decision that's dependent on the school, dependent on the classroom, dependent on the teacher, dependent on many other factors to whether or not you're in the right environment, and depending on the needs of the child, you know. Are there services being met better in a special ed classroom, or would you be better off in a general ed classroom? Now, in regards to actually the interventions themselves, sadly those that are diagnosed with dyslexia and really, you know, you want to intervene and provide remedial instruction, often families, you know, have to explore outside additional help in the form of either one-on-one tutoring, other programs, getting themselves educated. This is not an easy discussion to have, and it's one in which I really hope we can give our teachers a lot more support within the building. And I think the way that we do that is by what you guys are doing today, listening to more information. And so we can really, there is no teacher that doesn't want to teach and help the kids they're charged with. That's the bottom line. We need to know that. We need to salute that. But sadly, we are not giving all of that information that they need. We're not helping them fill their tool belts, which goes to kind of the advanced certification that we were talking about later on. So maybe I'll try to get through these next few slides pretty quickly so we can, you know, get to that section and talk a little bit more about
that.
And
I have one other question. I'll hold it for you as you move along then.
So I am going to let you guys read some of this stuff on the school-age children, because it's right there. Here's just a picture of the brain, the different activation areas. You can see in a 5-year-old, you can see that we've got this all, you know, we can see all these differences in activations, and those activations are not activation areas matter. Adults, how's it identified? We had talked about that earlier. Again, you can be a trained professional. You look at the strengths and the weaknesses. You look at the family history. As I said, it's very heritable. You can look at various factors, but a well-trained professional, which we'll get to later, can help you identify those characteristics. Okay, so when we come to evaluation and testing, you certainly want to look at language, the receptive and expression. That is, think of our SLPs. Our speech and language are rock stars in terms of oral language, but yet we sometimes, in our school environments, they're not set up to support the reading process as they should be. That's a whole nother webinar, but language is important. We need to understand their phonological processing, their auditory processing, phonemic awareness. We need to look at their working memories. A lot of our kids have working memory and rapid naming deficits, that their retrieval is not fast enough. That sometimes is called a double deficit sometimes. Kids can have weak phonological awareness, the kind of garden variety dyslexia, but they also can have layered on top of there the ability to process slowly, and maybe get the correct answer, but they're processing slowly and they have problems with working memory. They just can't remember. So you need to be able to test those things to really understand how they're going to learn what their deficits are. So you're going to you want to look at, their overall fluency. That's going to tell you something. Fluency is a huge, big word, and sometimes we talk about it like it's one isolated skill that is kind of remediated or dealt with all the same way. Nothing could be further from the truth. Fluency is an outcome. If you think of it, it's an outcome, but we treat it as something all by itself. Fluency is the bridge to comprehension. So you look at their spelling, their writing, their overall reading comprehension, and their overall cognitive ability. These are the measures that you really want to get at. But the ones I have highlighted here are kind of the guts, the foundation of really talking about the deficits of dyslexia. So you'll hear a bunch of names for dyslexia. Here they are. I'm not going to read through them all, but make no mistake, the thing to draw out here is this whole idea of reading disabilities are typically, not always, there are some other extenuating things, but typically we're looking at characteristics along a dyslexia continuum. And you need, regardless of what the names are, you have to remediate those weaknesses. So the heart of the problem is, I gave you an example earlier, your sound is ch, but it could be spelled two different ways, CH or TCH. How do you choose? That's a phonics rule. That is something you've got to be able to be taught. I'm going to skip this. Again, this is the heart of the problem, just linking sounds to and blending sounds together. Ask me a question later if this is going too fast, because we know that if you don't address this foundational phonemic awareness skill, you can look at your middle class, more secure environment of kids, and you're going to have a third of them need this skill. They're not going to get the insight on their own by themselves. They need further information. And that phonemic awareness, as I stated earlier, is the most potent predictor of success in academic, more so than any IQ testing. And you can include a phonemic awareness test, like a CTOP, for example. So it highly correlates to reading ability. And this, we've been going on for years about this since the late 90s. This is going to be the most difficult task, but most important task that somebody's got to acquire, master, and that is reading. And we know that there is going to be a whopping 30% just naturally that are going to struggle getting this information. So how do you treat it? You got to have an effectively trained teacher. This is where we want to go. The strategies to help you at home, in the home environment, is much oral reading, discussion, practice, regardless of their reading the material or not, but just give them information. And certainly multi-sensory, engaging the senses is very important in instruction. But I'm gonna skip this because this is the slide that is kind of tells it all. You need explicit, clear strategies. If a child, you might have to break it down to 20 steps for one child where someone else needs one or two or just what is wired to get it. You have to have a system. You can't be jumping all over the place. You have to, I'm teaching this, I'm practicing it, I'm teaching something else. You never introduce something unintentionally. It accumulates over time. Again, it is in a sequence, and you go in little chunks so the child can get it. And master it. And you've got to keep your data. What is the child knowing? What is being measured? You've got to make sure you assess everything along the way. So explicit and systematic, they're clearly explained. You don't make any assumptions about anything. cumulative, sequential, and incremental. You measure these steps, you address every component there is, and you're following a plan. You monitor your progress. You look at guided practice as your guide, and you move forward from that. You are constantly diagnosing on a day-to-day basis what is happening with your child. Multisensory learning is key, using all of your senses. If you think about how you learn something, it's a myth to think, oh, I'm a visual learner, or I'm only auditory. The more you can involve more senses, doing, touching, seeing, practicing, the better off you're going to get, and kids love song. So, elemental P, of course, a lot of us will go back to that song, and that's important for kids. So multisensory, intersensory learning. So what's different about instruction is you have to be able to have time that matches the child's need. And it can be, believe me, it can be 120 plus minutes a day. That's what some kids need. And you need to have the understanding of how phonics and the rules of our language works, and you got to teach it. There's multiple rules that people might need to learn. Not all, some just grab it. But you also have to understand that how many repetitions, how much practice does somebody need? I may get it very quickly, but someone else may need 100 repetitions. Think working memory, think processing speed. And of course you have to adjust that rate to child's need. And how fast is your pace? Is a child able to grab one new concept at a time, or can they grab two or more? Again, you have to really know your child. And this is why all of these things, this entire page, and if you think of in the school environment, are in particular when you think of maybe either small groups or even one-on-one instruction, using, quote, programs that are appropriate for this population. Typically, they're not enough time, they're not going deep enough, people aren't backtracking when the intensity isn't right, when the rate isn't right, and when the pace is going too fast. But teachers don't recognize that because they haven't been given the support they need to recognize it. So before we get into the teaching, some of that teaching and advanced certification that was raised, what can happen now, today, in school, to help these kids, even with some of the deficits? Certainly, we already know that as a child gets older, the demands grow. And so whether it's written work, project work, etc., your students may need and likely need additional time, because dyslexia robs a student of time. Everything is more difficult and takes more time. So they may need to be accommodated by having extra time for assignments, for projects. They may need a lot of help with note-taking. They may need notes to be given to them. They may need highlighting. They may need oral testing of their knowledge. They may be smart, hard workers, but they bomb on a test, on a quiz, on those traditional measures of testing. Maybe they read well enough where if they had less text to drag them down, maybe they need not modified information of the test, but modified oral language or text language on the test. Maybe they need the test read to them. They likely need books on tape and assistive technology. Technology is getting stronger and stronger and stronger and stronger, and it is absolutely key, particularly for your older students. Voice recognition and so on. And then, of course, some of our kids, sadly, too many of our kids are emotionally abused by this experience because they don't understand what's going on, and they may be in environments that aren't supporting it. So these are things that must be and can be talked about and accommodated within the body of an IEP and with teachers in school. So here we are. We're getting to the kind of the meat of the matter, and what's frankly very, very difficult, because it's hard for some of us to influence this in a way that's fast enough and deep enough and strong enough, because we have so much education of public, of legislators, of those in the school, because it fits the axiom, you don't know what you don't know. So how can, you can't fault people in certainly our teachers in our school for not knowing what they don't know. Somebody taught them what they didn't know. But now that we have the science, and we have gobs and gobs of science, the research is crystal clear. We need foundational standards in our universities of what elements should go into reading coursework. And the knowledge and practice standards for teachers of reading, which has been alluded, we did get a law passed 3 years ago that new teachers of reading and special educators must pass what frankly is a very basic, very preliminary reading examination. And that is in place, that is happening. But that is, whoever raised it is absolutely correct. That does not stand for those that are in the field already in education, already practicing. But that's kind of our next bastion of trying to, influence this. But I would encourage everyone to know what these teacher of reading standards here, the link is here, and there are new examinations that are going to be rolled out for educators, for those teaching readings, and for reading in general, and those that will be teaching dyslexia special. I invite you to look at these. I invite you to ask and to inquire wherever you are within the school, to your superintendents, to your teachers. Get familiar with what these standards look like. They are not broad. They are specific. Further, the International Dyslexia Association and their now offspring group will certify our higher ed schools of education programs, and there are many states that are schools rather, excuse me, universities that have been accredited across the country. Sadly, nothing in Wisconsin. Wisconsin's got some opportunities here. And then when it comes to individuals who are skilled, to be able to help this population, sadly, we really don't have anything within our traditional higher ed schools that really have teachers with sufficient knowledge. But we do have practitioners out there who have been certified through various agencies, the multidisciplinary language group, MSLIC, who have taken the Alliant registration exam, such as myself. I belong to a group called ALTA, the Academic Language Therapy Association. There are some speech pathology. This is a huge discussion right here. The bottom line is we need to improve the way the teachers are trained, their ongoing professional development, their mentoring, and so on and so forth. That is really the crux of how we get a better handle on this. There are many states that are looking at this, all of this accreditation issues. States like Ohio and many others now are starting to write, Texas are starting to, Mississippi, they're writing right into their statutes that there has to be a dyslexia specialist in either the school district, all schools. So we have a big capacity issue here. So here's some links to the programs that are of higher ed that are accredited right now. And I welcome you to look at this. And here is a link to the very tiny number in Wisconsin that are accredited nationally for being considered a tutor with dyslexia. So, oops, I went back. So at home, to reiterate, just be sure that if you have a child or an adult or anyone with, diagnosed with dyslexia, make sure you tap into those accommodations and provide as much ongoing information you can out, in an oral presentation every day. I also invite you to get involved. There's many groups that are out there now. I don't have a listing of them here, but I certainly, I know the Wisconsin branch of the International Dyslexia Association will be having on April 23rd, we'll be having a meeting up in Marshfield. That's, I invite you to check that out. I've got a link in a minute. But really, I understand that these kids and these adults have many, many strengths, and they can be very successful. And you really have to find those strengths and accommodate those weaknesses, and if you can, try to provide them with remedial instruction. So I've got 3 pages of guides here from this slide, and I believe that there's 8 guides that I have links to. I would invite you to look at these guides. These guides are comprehensive in terms of talking about the symptoms, characteristics, interventions, accommodations, resources. Please pull up these guides. They will be enormously valuable. Share them with your students, teachers. Share them with teachers, administrators in the classroom. These guides are essential, and hopefully we're going to get one here in Wisconsin. But we don't need to reinvent the wheel. We've got some really good guides here. So you can see some of the states. Minnesota is the newest edition, and it is a wonderful guide. Texas being the oldest. So please don't wait to fail. Get your kids. You got any issues, whether you're a parent or a teacher, do not wait to fail. Understand that this is about supporting teacher preparation and ongoing professional development. Teachers deserve as much preparation as they can. So really, this is the biggest need we have in our school for all populations, all cognitive abilities, is the ability to be sure that they read to as much mastery as possible. We have to educate our leaders in our school, because after all, they're the ones making the decisions. We need to start to challenge perceptions of teachers who think that they are teaching reading, but yet our outcomes aren't showing that. We have to educate the public and potentially our legislators, if we, are to really get a handle on this, because this is, I don't even think of dyslexia as a disability. It isn't a disability. It's how some of our population is wired. So I've got, I believe, 3 minutes for questions, so I'm ready.
Okay, I do have a bunch of questions for you, Cheryl. The first one that we held before was, how can we as educators keep our students' self-esteem intact while we work with them on dyslexia?
Well, I think the best way to keep their self-esteem intact is identify it head on. You've got a reading disability. If you have the name dyslexia, use it. If not, that's okay. But say you've got this, and I just used the word disability, didn't I? But I would say you have a profile that has a weakness. Identify what it is, and that you are not alone, that this is enormously common, that there are many of us that learn to struggle. And I would be about as honest as you possibly could be and try to help as much as you can, and acknowledge that they're not different, they're not weird, and that you as an individual, whether you're a parent or teacher, are trying to do and support them as much as possible. Just having that is going to go a long way to have someone realize they're not dumb and they're not weird. And what's the matter?
Okay, we have another question. Why do supports seem to disappear in schools after elementary interventions, especially if it has taken students years to learn to read? Wouldn't these students be considered beginning or emerging readers? and concerned with computer programs taking the place of educators as well.
Well, again, this questioner is spot on, and I think that is strictly the best answer I can give you at this point is, yeah, that's the reality, but it's the reality because we don't have enough education out there. We're not meeting their needs K through 8, right? So by the time they get to high school, the games often, and I won't say every school, there's inconsistencies, but when they get to high school, kind of all of that's behind them. It's all about accommodations now, particularly if they are average to above average. They might have skills in other areas, which is great. It's fabulous, but they just won't address it appropriately, and that is because they don't have the knowledge. It couldn't be more simple. They don't know what to do, and they can't do it.
Okay, moving on to the next question. Do you feel that the leveled language intervention is a good program for targeting the needs of dyslexic readers?
Well, this is probably going to be the most blunt I'll be. No, not at all. It's as simple as that. No, not at all.
Okay, let's move on to the next question. Those recommendations sound great, but in reality, at average school, chances are that the special ed setting is not going to be able to be successful. Are there ways to ensure needed time or intensity, et cetera, or otherwise?
Again, another completely, accurate observation and fair question or comment. I think, again, it really is dependent on the comfort level of the teacher that on the team to raise the question, to make the case, for the parent to feel comfortable, to get educated, to make the case, etc., for having a good, strong IEP that looks at the section for supplemental services, I-9, and gets additional professional development, because yes, sadly, that sadly is all true. And the issue is the longer you wait, the more time you need, because there's more ground to cover. And so the best thing is to do is start in early childhood, those early years of K through 2nd grade, and do it right. And that's where our focus. So we are in literally a very large in-between time that is going to be very painful for many students, many families, and many teachers.
And I do have one more question, or actually there's two more questions. One is the phonetics game effective for this population? And just to let those know who are on the line, we will stay on the line until we complete these questions. Go ahead, please, Cheryl. Is the phonetics game effective?
Well, I assume that they're saying phonetics game as a product is what I'm thinking. I have to say, I'm not exactly sure if I'm familiar with the phonetics game, but I can feel comfortable in saying this. There are some nice things out there, but you have to know what the child's needs are. And often, just the fact that you're saying the phonetics game has the word phonics. Again, many of our kids have weaknesses that precede phonics. And again, that could be another, webinar. But yeah, so I'm real reluctant to say, yeah, that would help this population. I don't believe that would true. Could it help an individual student? Yeah, maybe.
Okay, and then the last question that I do have here is that schools are turning to personalized learning and inclusion. How is this working in a corner, not a privacy issue, or quiet enough for these students to learn?
Well, again, another really hot topic, and one that I just was on a listserv this morning where people were talking about co-teaching, special ed being pushed into the gen ed, and the pushback, the teachers, these were other states, giving their leadership, administrators and stuff, and there's some research that's happening now that typically these kids get less one-on-one intervention, less intervention in general. So that's one thing. The second thing is I think inclusion is often misunderstood in terms of really helping the child. I think there's a lot of pressure on educators to not identify for special ed, to teach them right, to do 2 and 3, and have those interventions before they get identified with a reading disability. And frankly, we haven't been doing well, and a report just came out in November from the National Center for Education Evaluation and the regional centers, where RTI is not. I mean, the first graders, they're looking at them and they are in an RTI setting, for example, which is often a precursor to, sometimes getting a diagnosis, so sadly so, but they are not, RTI is not working in many of our schools.
Unfortunately, we're going to have to end our webinar at this time. I know that there are maybe a couple of other questions that we can't get to at this time, so if you wouldn't mind addressing whatever questions are left over. Cheryl has graciously provided her email address there, and I know that she'd be glad to answer the questions. Right, Cheryl?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Please feel free.
And again, then this concludes our webinar. My thanks today to Cheryl Ward, who has done just a wonderful job today in providing us with lots and lots of information that I know that both parents and professionals who have been on the line will be able to take back and utilize. Wisconsin Facets has over 100 scheduled trainings and webinars for 2016, and please feel free to check out our website calendar and register for any upcoming trainings that are available to you. And please watch for the short evaluation coming up to you in the email that will follow this workshop. Have a great rest of the day, and again, thank you so very much, Cheryl, for your expertise today, and to everybody for your attendance. Bye now, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye, Cheryl. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.